Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we are going over another big match from Socal Sword Fight 2025, the semifinals match between Cheney and Antoni Olbrychski. Now, this is obviously a really big fight, not just because they are both high-level fencers, but because specifically this is the fight for the first place spot in HEMA ratings overall. At the time of the tournament, Cheney had the #1 spot, and of course Antoni Olbrychski has had the #1 spot in the past, being I think only number 4 or 5 at the time, which of course means that if he beats #1, he's certainly going to catapult all the way up there, and if you lose to somebody in the #1 spot, you're obviously going to lose enough ELO to drop to about 4 or 5 yourself. So it's a really big and really important fight, and unfortunately it's happening in the semifinals and not the finals, which means that the loser of this fight can at best win 3rd place, which doesn't always feel great and doesn't feel like it's the proper sort of reward for potentially winning or losing to one of the best fencers in the country. But that was Socal Sword Fight 2025 in a nutshell. Chances are, if you got all the way to the semifinals, you were facing someone in the top 5 in the world already, and there really wasn't anything you could do about it. So here we go with this fight, and we're going to see a lot of great adaptations here. So for our first exchange here, we have the classic Cheney move. Now, as I said earlier, both Antoni and Steven both know what the favorite technique of the opposite fighter is. Antoni knows exactly what Cheney's most favorite technique is to throw, especially right out of the gate. And to his credit, the reason for that is that Cheney is very, very good at landing it, even against some of the highest level fencers in the world. So he goes for it. And in a lot of ways, there is a really, really good reason to go for it. And that is having any sort of points go up on the board in the first exchange is a great position to be in. It allows you to completely dictate the pace of the fight, not only in terms of the score, but in terms of what your opponent's adaptations are going to be. If you were the first person to score points, your opponent now has to be the one to think about what they are going to change. If you score the points first, you can now simply say, I am going to continue to do the same thing over and over again until my opponent gets the better of me. Or if you're in a really high level fight like this one, I can now work my adaptations off of the expectation that I'm going to do the same thing over and over again in order to keep the score where it is. So Cheney goes for his favorite attack, and Antoni is one step ahead of him slightly and gets a very nice parry riposte off of that. Now, what you want to pay attention to here is not just how Olbrychski managed to get the parry riposte. That was by leaning backwards, going backwards very quickly, parrying, and then, of course, throwing something very, very tight to his body. I believe it is a left zwerk here that allows him to pull his hands back naturally so that he can actually land with the blade rather than getting stuffed. At the exact same time as this is happening, Cheney does another thing that he does quite a lot, which is every single time he throws his big ballistic strike to the center, he always follows it up in that clash together with a little bit of a hand push towards his opponent's head. The reason this is so effective is that it can very easily stuff the right zwerkow, but it's a little bit less effective at stuffing the left zwerkow, which is of course what Olbrychski throws. So Olbrychski gets a clean couple of points that puts him critically up on the board, which also means that Cheney is now the one who is going to have to start making these adaptations. So for our second exchange, and yes, I did skip one because it was thrown out and the judge was a little bit in front of the camera, we have a adaptation here from both fencers. Cheney knows that he needs some points up on the board if he is going to be able to take control of the fight again and make sure that things are going to start happening the way he wants them to happen. At the exact same time, it seems like he is starting to become a little bit more defensive in this particular exchange, and I believe it's because he is looking to bait out Anton's favorite attack, that ballistic thrust that he's so famous for. Now, at the exact same time, what we see here is Anton very clearly trying to set up his favorite technique. But the way that he sets this up is actually very, very interesting. What Anton is doing here is setting up a very interesting footwork trap. Now, when many people are trying to land a thrust, what they are looking to do is get a little bit of forward momentum going. And more specifically, what they want to do is they want to look at their opponent's dominant side parry. Because everybody who fences from a static position, more or less, on a favored kind of position where they feel comfortable. And when they see a threat coming at them, they have one parry that they always throw first when they are surprised. So if you're looking to land a really big, really long extended ballistic thrust, what you need to make sure of is that you are not throwing it into the place where your opponent's reactionary parry is going to be, obviously. So most people set this up by coming forward a little bit, doing some ducks with their blade, making sure that whatever their opponent thinks is going to happen isn't what actually happens. And then they're going to choose their target based on where that opening is. Antec does the same thing, but he does it in reverse. What Anton does is he shuffles backwards, waits for his opponent to try to match his backward momentum by coming forward, but also throws out some probing strikes and some gestures with his hands to still get a read on that dominant kind of parry. So what Anton is doing here is every single time he takes a big step backwards, he takes a big step backwards with his back foot, great, and then pulls his front foot up to match. But he doesn't just pull it to the normal spot that he was before he took his first step. He pulls it back even further. And the reason he's doing this is he is spring loading his back foot. The further you pull your front foot backwards, closer to your back foot, the closer your feet are together and the more bend you have in your back leg and even a little bit in your front leg. The reason he is doing this is because he is backing up, waiting for his opponent to start to come forward, and then unleashing that big loaded spring of his leg directly towards his opponent, making sure that the combination of the forward momentum of his opponent and the extreme forward momentum of himself is going to cut the window of the time that you have to try to parry that attack to almost nothing. And it just about makes it. Antoni manages to get his thrust going. Stephen Cheney throws his parry out there and manages to parry it from the center line of his head or chest and just over into the left shoulder. A really great execution of a technique, a great demonstration of how footwork traps work, and most importantly, a great understanding that just because you know what's coming doesn't always mean that you have the ability to stop it. As we've seen here now, Stephen Cheney has thrown his favorite technique and most successful technique and managed to get parry riposted, and now Anton has thrown his best and most favorite technique and has managed to land it. So right now, Stephen Cheney is definitely on the back foot in this fight because he has to start throwing some real serious adaptations out there. Otherwise, the pace of the fight has been very nicely dictated by Anton. So the score is definitely against Stephen Cheney in this exchange, and it is in this exchange that Stephen Cheney pulls off the greatest adaptation, I think, in this fight. Specifically, he manages to pull off Anton's favorite move against him, immediately after it just worked against him. And it's set up in basically the exact same way. Both fencers are moving back and forth, going for some cheeky hand shots, at which point Stephen Cheney leaps backwards and couches his right leg into a proper stance. He spring loads his back foot and he waits for Anton to come forward and match his footwork, which Anton does. However, you can almost see the panic in Anton's mind when he comes forward because he realizes a little bit too late that he has just fallen for the same trap that he is so famous for setting up on other people. He starts to move his front leg forward and immediately regrets it, slamming his front foot into the ground and attempting to turn around 180 degrees to get away from the situation he's just placed himself in. Of course, it is too little too late, and Stephen Cheney seizes on the opportunity instantly, throwing his own ballistic thrust straight into the upper left shoulder of Anton, exactly as Anton had just done to him. Now, just in the exact same situation as before, Anton tries to parry the thrust, gets stabbed, and recognizes that the only thing that he can do now is to throw a riposte and either hope the judges didn't see it, or more importantly, to at least deduct some points from Stephen Cheney's 3-point shot to the chest, which he does. Now, in this rule set, after blows could only really deduct you points. There was no situation where you would hit somebody in the leg and then they would hit you back in the head and get 2 out of their 3 points. That wasn't really how it worked. Because after blows could only deduct, that was effectively what Anton was trying to make sure to do. If he threw any kind of afterblow after he was stabbed in the chest, he was ensuring that the number of points that Stephen Cheney got would be 1 less, which of course puts the emphasis on Cheney and any other fighter in this situation to parry immediately after you land an attack of any kind to make sure that your opponent can't take something away from you. Now, this next exchange is simultaneously a clash of adaptations and, more importantly, a really great demonstration on how best these two fencers can think on their feet and adapt to situations even as they are unfolding. So, for this exchange, we see, again, a little bit of back and forth. But what happens towards the end of the exchange is that Stephen Cheney goes in for another one of his classic ballistic thrusts. But in my mind, at least from looking at the footage, it looks like he was attempting to kind of feint it a little bit. He goes in for a big attack and then tries to deviate his angle ever so slightly, I believe to try to cut in and turn what would normally be a kind of Scheitelhau, a very vertical cut straight across to the top of the head, into more of a Zornhau, one that crosses a line and critically attempts to defend as well as attack. At this exact same time, Anton is doing the exact same thing. He's throwing a little bit of a Zornhau, a little bit of a Scheitelhau straight down to the top. Now, in my opinion, looking at this exchange, it's unclear whether or not either of these attacks really land. It looks like Anton's gets really, really close to landing, but this is also the angle of the camera. It's always going to look like the angle of the attack that the sword is facing is much closer than it actually is, because it's always going to go over the top of its target, regardless of whether or not it actually makes it there. Similarly, I'm sure if the camera was on the right side of this exchange, we would have seen something very similar from Cheney's strike, which looks like it got right over the top of this area, but maybe didn't quite make contact. But what really, really matters in this exchange is what both of these fencers do as a follow-up. Now, it is very common in the world of HEMA to land or think you land in a strike and then just kind of shut down. And it's a very common thing that happens because a lot of people are spending their entire thought process trying to get to the point where they land that technique. So as soon as they land it, the thought process ends. The brain shuts down and they just stand there. And it's very important to point out that neither of these fencers, who might have both had reason to believe that they both landed a strike, shut down. They both continue their action, and the action that they continue is really, really interesting. Stephen Cheney is very, very adept at doing this kind of mid-range grappling right when two people are about to meet and clash, and this is a really interesting execution of that same basic principle. As soon as Stephen Cheney throws his attack and recognizes either that he landed it or got parried, he immediately disconnects his left hand and shoots it directly into the two hands of Anton. Now, at this exact moment, Anton, who either believes that he has landed his attack or believes that he has successfully zorned his opponent's technique out, is now going for a follow-up riposte. And this punch towards the guard of his opponent allows Stephen Cheney to simultaneously stuff any kind of follow-up action, and most importantly, make it so that he can disconnect his right hand and do another follow-up strike with his right hand at the exact same time as he's trying to stuff his opponent. So, Stephen Cheney disconnects his left hand, punches the guard, and simultaneously comes down over the top with his own sword. At this exact same time, Anton gets his right Zwerchau punched, which means that it goes from being pretty well distanced and pretty well timed to being stuffed down back towards his head and comes out a little bit flat, but recognizing that it has been punched and that a follow-up strike is coming, he also deviates the path of his Zwerchau to not just flat slap Stephen Cheney in the top of the shoulder, but also couch it back by this head and parry the follow-up strike that was inevitably going to come right back down onto his head or onto his hands. It's an extremely complicated interaction, and one that I'm probably going to need some arrows to demonstrate here. But ironically, this was declared a shot to the head for Anton. And while I don't necessarily agree that it really made it all the way there, I can definitely see how the judges might have seen that. Ironically, though, the judges also might have been calling the flat Zwerchau to the head, not necessarily recognizing that it was stuffed properly by Stephen Cheney's punch, but at the exact same time, Stephen Cheney was unable to get a shot of his own because Anton was still able to parry that stuffed punch plus afterblow and simply was not really struck appropriately. So, in my opinion, this entire exchange really should have washed out to nothing, but it really still does demonstrate how close the margin of error is in a high-level fight like this, and the difference between getting 2 points with an afterblow or 3 points with an afterblow and just getting absolutely nothing at all comes down to a matter of inches. Now, I've skipped 2 exchanges here, and this one is a double, and normally I would actually skip this one as well. But in this particular interaction, it gives me a good opportunity to talk about the rules of Socal Sword Fight. And one of the very interesting interactions that you can see in this rule set is the rule that it has for doubles. Now, most people are pretty well versed in what a double is. It's where both people hit each other in the first intention. But this is a little bit more complicated by the fact that Socal Sword Fight's rule set, in a sense, has a kind of attack priority. One thing I mentioned earlier is that Afterblows can only be deductive, meaning that if you land an attack and you get afterblowed, that afterblow can only reduce the number of points that the attack got, meaning that you can go for as low of a target as you want, but the afterblow isn't going to determine whether or not somebody gets points. It's going to determine whether or not you get any or some. So, as a particular example here in this exchange, Anton goes deep and low for a leg cut. And in situations like this, you can pretty much guarantee that when someone commits this hard to hitting you in the leg, they're going to get you in the leg. There's really not much you can do about it. But under this rule set, the only thing that you can do about it is to try to hit them in the head. The reason, of course, being is that if you hit somebody in the leg, you only get 2 points for a clean shot. But if you hit someone in the head, you get 3 points for a clean shot, meaning that the afterblow, the 3-point shot, will deduct more points than you would gain for that leg shot, effectively rendering the entire pass meaningless. Nobody gets any points, nobody gets nothing. But this was not ruled a leg shot with afterblow. This was ruled a double. And it's very, very important to understand the difference, because in a system where you have a kind of attack priority, this is a adaptation that you're going to see a lot from different kinds of fencers. One in which they know that as long as they get something on their initial attack, that's what they should be going for every single time. So you need almost an extra layer of punishment for two fencers who have recognized this fact and are now just only going for that initial action over and over and over again and discarding everything else. And that is the double rule. Now, in Socal Swords, a double was no points for anybody, regardless of where you hit or where the afterblow came. And that means that you cannot simply rely on hitting someone in the head to cancel out their extremely low and deep leg shot. It also means that the punishment for a double goes to both people. And the punishment for doubles in pools was potentially a double loss for the fight. And I believe in eliminations, it is a negative point against you in follow-up fights. Now, you had to get a certain number of doubles in order to get that punishment, and you had to get them in the course of a single fight, which is actually pretty difficult to do when most fights only go to 10, 12 exchanges. I believe the number is something like 4 or 5. But either way, the important thing to point out here is that both of these fencers are clearly trying to adapt around this kind of pseudo-attack priority rule set. Anton has chosen to go for this big, low attack to the leg because he knows most of the time, as long as he lands his attack, he's going to get at least 1 point. But in this particular instance, the exact counter was to actually punish both people, and Stephen Cheney, in my opinion, has done really the one importantly critical move that is to make sure that Anton doesn't get points when he throws out stuff like this. It's a little bit unfortunate that the punishment has to go to both people, but given that the chances of them actually reaching that 4, 5, or 6 double limit, whatever it is actually pretty low, it is a really critical adaptation here to play to the rule set and to understand that if someone is going to play to the rule set by going for a big, long, deep leg cut with both hands on the sword, well, there's really only one thing you can do about it to make sure that nobody gets any points, and that's exactly what happened here. So our next exchange appears to be very simple on the surface, but is, in my opinion, a little bit more complicated. The exchange is simply Anton sniping Stephen Cheney in the hands. Great. But the reason that it was pulled off and the reason that it managed to get around the expert level hand defense of Stephen Cheney is a bit more complicated than it maybe appears. Anton does do the classic thing to get around the normal hand defense of a longsword. Namely, a longsword has horizontal crossguard quillions that stick out to each side, and they are what are used to defend your hands. Now, given that the crossguard is horizontal, the attacks that it's best at defending against are vertical ones. So in order to get around that natural defense, Anton is throwing a very steep 45 and below angle cut towards the hand, and he's also lowering the level of the cut to make sure that he doesn't end up in the strong of a sword and make sure that he hits like one of those big beefy clamshells. So he manages to land it. But That's not the only form of defense that Stephen Cheney was using. You can see as he's coming forward, he is gesturing up, and probably what he's trying to do is make sure that Anton goes backwards, because he wants Anton to back himself into the back of the ring and making sure that he can't do some of his parry riposte techniques with that extra bit of defensive motion. But as he's coming forward, he's not just coming forward raising his hands up and getting ready to do it, because that's where most people get hand shot. Instead, he's coming forward with his hands in a cron position. And this position is normally very, very good at defending against hand shots, not just, again, because of that horizontal crossguard, but because of your ability to tilt your sword to either side and move that shield in the form of your crossguard towards the incoming angle of your opponent's hand strike. And Stephen Cheney very clearly tries to do this. The problem isn't that he chose to do the wrong technique to defend his hands, but he chose the wrong side. And the reason he chose the wrong side is because Anton did not just simply throw a hand shot at Stephen Cheney's hands, he feinted a hand shot on one side and then came around to a shot on the hands. What we see here from Stephen Cheney is that he's up here in his cron, he very briefly tilts it to his left side to try to defend the left side of his hands, which is where he thought the attack was coming, only to have opened up his hands on the right side, which is where Anton actually was throwing that technique. That crucial little feint, just enough that most people wouldn't have even perceived it, but Stephen Cheney most certainly did, and it was just enough for his very particular opponent to open up that spot that Anton then eventually sought. At the exact same time, of course, he had to be wary of the fact that he's doing this while moving backwards, and Stephen Cheney can, at any time, throw a very big attack towards his head and just come out in the differential right there. So a really critical adaptation here from Anton that doesn't really come out in the footage so well, but if you know how this works and you know that you've tried it before, you know just how difficult it can be, both simultaneously to defend your hands accurately and to set up a situation where someone can expose their hands when they have really good hand shot defense. Now, I've skipped another exchange and come to this exchange, which in my opinion is one of the more interesting and controversial, potentially, exchanges in this fight. And the reason I say that is because there was a lot of interactions here where the intent of both fighters was subverted by, in a lot of ways, random chance, and the fact that the intentions of the other fencer were just so unusual that they didn't really seem to know exactly what they were doing or what they wanted to do until they had already kind of gotten to the end. So in this particular exchange, Anton is holding his sword out far, and he's playing some tip games. Namely, he is tapping his sword into Stephen Cheney's sword, ducking under the blade over and over again, and essentially telling him that he's going to go for a big thrust. Stephen Cheney keeps his sword out as well and is basically playing the same game, saying, hey, if you're going to go for a big thrust, maybe I'll go for a big thrust. And if you deviate from that thrust, well, we both know what's going to happen. And Anton is the first to deviate from that pattern. He pulls his sword back and low and couches a really big Unterhau. And this is a very interesting decision because when you're standing out with your sword forward and then you pull it back into an Unterhau, you create a very, very obvious opportunity to get stabbed. Luckily for Anton, Stephen Cheney does not immediately follow up with a stab to the chest, which probably would have gotten him a lot of points, but instead tries to parry the attack that he sees Anton throwing, which is, of course, this big low Unterhau. And he does manage to parry it, but he has to parry it in a very, very unusual way. Normally, when somebody is coming in for an Unterhau, you can kind of just crump it on top of the blade and kind of get away with it. But in this particular case, Stephen Cheney was also trying to make sure that he could follow up with a thrust, and so he keeps his hands unbroken and keeps his wrists pretty straight when he goes for this parry, and instead tries to angle his body away from the cut in order to stay safe. The result, however, is that Anton, who has gone very, very low and lunged pretty deep, does manage to make some contact onto the leg with his cut at the exact same time as it gets bound up fist to fist against Stephen Cheney's guard. Immediately after that, Stephen Cheney takes a little bit of a pivot step, a little bit of an extra half second to take control of this very strong overbind, and then kind of shield house over the top or snappins over the top and hits Anton in the head. And of course, from this position that Anton has put himself in, there's really not much he can do as a follow-up. He's committed so far forward that he either lands that leg shot or he ends up taking big steps off to the side from which he can't really meaningfully recover. So the question here is, what is that leg shot really? And in my opinion, one of the problems with this particular leg shot is that I believe that Anton really expected Stephen Cheney to go backwards with his parry, which he did not. And as a result, Anton got unreasonably close to his target before he was really able to start finishing that Unterhau part. And in my opinion, the travel that the blade has is really just not sufficient. It doesn't really change its angle very much. When Anton pulls his hands back, he pulls them back to have this low kind of cocked position, but then he just slams his fists into the fists of Stephen Cheney and then tries to kind of make that attack. And that's not a great position to do so. Also, the blades were already sort of locked strong to strong before that leg shot was really going to land. So in my opinion, just not a great shot overall, not a great choice of shot. And in a lot of ways, Anton was very lucky that not only did Stephen Cheney choose to try to parry it, but he chose to try to parry in that particular way. Because if he had simply gone forward, like I said earlier, and stabbed, he obviously would have landed that first before that leg shot even got there. And more importantly, too, though, if he had gone straight backwards, chances are the parry that Stephen Cheney threw would have been even more effective. Because the reason that this leg shot had the ability to really reach its target is because Stephen Cheney tried to throw a little bit of a parry and then immediately tried to thrust in an afterblow. This thrust didn't, of course, make it to its target. It slid right around the right arm. But not only did it slide off, but that forward push of the crossguard and the sword that Stephen Cheney did made it so that it kind of pushed his fists into Anton's fist and took a lot of the stink out of that upwards Unterhau. And if Stephen Cheney had moved backwards, that same push technique would have been done strong to strong rather than fist to fist, and there would have been even more lockout on that parry. So a really unique interaction here where I believe Anton got away with probably the one form of defense that was going to make it possible for him to even really reach this leg shot. And similarly, a situation where thankfully the judges gave him a lot of credit for that leg shot, meaning that Stephen Cheney's afterblow to the head was nothing more than an afterblow, reducing some of the points. So Olbrychski here got a cheeky little point that, again, maybe shows us how important that attack priority rule set is really coming into play. So we come now to the final exchange, and very unfortunately, based on the score, this was a situation in which Stephen Cheney was not really able to bail himself out of. He had been down on so many points here that even a clean 3-point exchange to the head was not going to get him the victory. However, for what it is worth, he does come very, very close to landing exactly that. Now, in result, this exchange is exactly the same as one of the initial ones, where Stephen Cheney goes in with his ballistic overhow, gets parried, and riposted to the head. Unfortunate. However, if you watch this in the slow motion, one thing that you want to notice here is that when Cheney comes forward with his big ballistic attack, he lands directly into the Kron crossguard of Anton. However, Anton's Kron is below his chin, which means that he's really relying on the fact that he's leaning backwards and going backwards to make sure that he doesn't get hit by the cut. But if you know anything about Stephen Cheney's ballistic cuts, you know that they're always followed up by a thrust. And what's really ironic here is that when you watch the slow-mo, you see that cut come in, you see it hit the crossguard, and then you see it bounce. And that bounce that it gets is just enough to bounce it over the head of Anton as he goes for his follow-up Zwerk. Meaning that if it hadn't bounced as much, maybe just 1 or 2 inches lower, the follow-up thrust that cut came from was just going to blast Anton directly in the face. I can definitely see an interaction here where this exact same situation happens and Stephen Cheney comes away with 3 clean points because his sword gets stuck into the top of the overlay of Anton's mask exactly as he's trying to throw his left Zwerkow and just gets completely zoned out from distance alone. It's really sad to see, in my opinion, because this was a perfectly executed cut to thrust combination, and one that capitalizes so classically on people's exact kinds of parry riposte mechanics that we see Anton doing here. Normally, Stephen Cheney is very happy if you try to crawl to left Sverk his ballistic Oberhau, because this is exactly what he does to you. He throws that cut, you pair it in your cron, you've done everything right, and suddenly when you feel like you're going for that left Sverk, there's a point in your face. And it's really, really hard to pull off. And as you can see here, you can see why it's so hard to pull off, because getting that tip control after you have just thrown a big ballistic cut is really difficult to do. Sometimes not just because of what you're doing wrong, but because we have these bouncy, flexible swords that are having your tip go in all kinds of weird, funky directions. It's unfortunate because I think Stephen Cheney would have been really happy with this ballistic thrust straight to the head and just didn't get it clean. And honestly, if you don't look at the slow motion footage, you might think that it was his mistake to have been made, when, in my opinion, it was really Anton's mistake. Anton made the mistake of cron parrying too low, and he just barely got away with not getting punished for it. But that is the way that the fight ended, and that is the way that the results came. So Stephen Cheney lost in this semifinals match and went on to fight for third, which is, of course, another fight that I am going to review because it was another fight against one of the best fencers in the world. So if you would like to see more Socal content, it's coming whether you like it or not, and hopefully you like this one and can wait around till Thursday to see some more.